Deponent verbs. This lesson is covered in Book 2, Lesson 18. Deponent verbs are passive in Latin but translated actively in English. Deponent verbs are simple, yet at the same time they're confusing. They are the verbs that only have passive forms in Latin but are always translated actively in English. The trick to translating deponent verbs correctly is being able to recognize them in Latin. Here is the complete list of the deponent verbs you are expected to recognize. A complete list of these verbs can be found on the Latin 2 website and in the Latin 2 workbook, or you may simply just pause the video. Deponent verbs follow the regular patterns of their given conjugations. This is a deponent synopsis of loquor. Loquor is part of the third conjugation. It follows the same patterns that you'd expect for a normal third conjugation like pono. The only difference is that they are always passive in Latin, but yet translated actively in English. Participles and infinitives of deponent verbs are not always in the passive form in Latin, but they are always translated actively in English. The exceptions are the present participle, the future participle, and the future infinitive, which are active in both Latin and English. Remember, all forms of deponent verbs are translated actively in English. Where do deponents come from? The answer may be due to the fact that these verbs were originally intransitive, meaning they do not take a direct object, or felt to be passive in significance. We may classify these into three groups. 1. Verbs of motion, such as gradior. 2. Verbs having a passive meaning, such as morior, die. Verbs of getting or obtaining for oneself, nankiscor, to gain for oneself. Thus, the passive endings of these verbs may have originated from the feeling that the action represented by them was passive or only weakly active. Their use as full transitive verbs taking a direct objects, in other words, is probably a later development, or at any rate an outgrowth of the primary use as transitive verbs. Remember, for deponent verbs, they are passive in Latin, following the regular patterns of their conjugation, but always translated actively in English. Passive in Latin, active in English, and that should keep it simple. Remember your list to recognize.